Thank you for tuning into the video. If you enjoy listening to scary stories, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Any help would be greatly appreciated. And now, let's begin. I never should have taken that detour. It started as a simple weekend trip. I had a few days off and decided to visit my uncle's cabin in upstate New York, nestled deep in the Adirondacks. I'd been there before, once when I was a kid, and a couple of times in my early 20s, but it had been years since my last visit. I was overdue for some time away from everything, work, the city, people. Just me, the trees, and the cold mountain air. I left Friday morning, hoping to beat the weekend traffic. It was supposed to be an easy drive, mostly highway, then a long stretch of winding roads through dense forest. But about 3 hours in, I hit a detour sign, some kind of road maintenance according to the flashing sign beneath it. I cursed under my breath. The GPS adjusted automatically, rerouting me through an unfamiliar path, a smaller state road that branched off and wove deeper into the woods. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. The road was paved, albeit narrow, and the scenery was actually kind of nice. The farther I drove, the thicker the trees became, towering over the road on both sides, swallowing the daylight. After about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another car in a while. I checked my phone. No service. Not unusual in the mountains, but still, it made me uneasy. I kept going, watching the GPS, hoping it would guide me back to a main road soon, but after another 15 minutes, the pavement ended. Just like that, it turned into a dirt road, littered with potholes and dead leaves. My GPS still showed this as the correct route, so I hesitated for only a second before pressing on. I drove slowly, feeling every bump and dip in the road. The forest seemed thicker now. The sky had turned overcast, dull gray light filtering through the canopy. I told myself it was fine, just a longer detour than I expected. Then I saw the house. It was old, crumbling, half hidden behind the trees. A 2-story structure, its wooden exterior dark with age, the paint peeling in long strips. The windows were either boarded up or too grimy to see through. The front door hung slightly ajar, swaying just a little in the breeze. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have just kept driving. But something about the place caught my attention. It looked wrong, out of place, like it had been forgotten by time. A part of me wanted to just pass by, pretend I hadn't seen it. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, leading up to the front door. I don't know why, but I pulled over. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. A feeling I couldn't quite place. Almost like I wasn't in control of my own actions. I cut the engine and sat there, staring at the house. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind. Just an eerie stillness that pressed against my ears. Then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. My breath caught. I turned my head sharply, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows shifting between the trunks. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head at myself. Just nerves. Just the isolation getting to me. And then, from inside the house, I heard it. A low, rhythmic knocking. It wasn't coming from the door. It was deeper inside, muffled, like it was coming from within the walls. I shouldn't have gotten out of the car, but I did. I don't know what I was expecting as I stepped onto the creaking porch. I peered inside through the open door. It was dark. The air smelled damp, like rotting wood and something else. Something foul, like death. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the emptiness inside. The knocking had stopped. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew, logically, that the smart thing to do was to leave, get back in my car, and go. But instead, I took another step inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by my presence. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, stained with water damage. A long hallway stretched ahead, disappearing into darkness. I swallowed hard and reached for my phone, flipping on the flashlight. And that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just barely illuminated by my light, there was a door. Unlike the rest of the house, which was in utter disrepair, this door looked new. The wood was smooth, polished, a stark contrast to the decaying surroundings. The knocking started again. This time, it was definitely coming from behind that door. I backed up, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, something behind me shifted. A whisper of movement, a breath of air that wasn't mine. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly. The entrance was still open. The porch was empty. The trees beyond stood still, but I knew I wasn't alone. I ran. I didn't look back. I bolted out of that house and nearly tripped down the porch steps. The moment I was back in my car, I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas pedal, kicking up dirt as I sped away. I didn't stop driving for miles. Not until I saw another car, not until I reached the main road. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was still watching. That night, in my uncle's cabin, I barely slept. The worst part? The part that kept me awake, staring at the ceiling, heart hammering. Before I finally left that house, as I turned to run, I saw something scratched into the wood near the doorway. Just a few words, deep and jagged, as if carved with frantic desperation. "Don't open the door." I hadn't, but someone had. That night at my uncle's cabin, I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the window. My breath hitched as I lay there, staring at the ceiling. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the wooden walls, making the entire cabin creak. But that sound, that slow, deliberate scraping, wasn't the wind. I swallowed hard and turned my head toward the window. The room was dark, but my eyes adjusted enough to make out the vague shape of trees swaying in the night. My uncle's cabin was isolated deep in the woods, with no nearby neighbors. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. Holding my breath, I reached for my phone and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the window. Nothing. Just my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and tense. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to relax. It had to be a branch, maybe a raccoon, something harmless. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped it in shock. My heart lurched as I glanced at the screen. No caller ID. A cold dread settled over me. I debated ignoring it, but something in my gut told me to answer. I hesitated for only a second before swiping my thumb across the screen. Hello? Silence. Then, a faint, distorted whisper. You shouldn't have stopped. I sat up. Who is this? A soft, static-filled breath was the only response before the line cut dead. I stared at my phone, the screen now blank, my own reflection staring back at me once again. My stomach twisted into knots. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but I still didn't have service. Just a single bar, flickering in and out. I jumped at the sound of a thud outside. I forced myself out of bed and crept toward the window, my feet barely making a sound against the wooden floor. I peeked through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the dark. Then I saw the footprints leading up to the cabin door. I took a shaky breath, willing myself to think rationally. Maybe it was my uncle, back early. Maybe it was a lost hiker. But I knew better, because the footprints, they weren't there earlier, and they weren't leading away. Just to the door. Another thud. Closer. This time, against the porch. I backed away, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The smart thing to do was to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for daylight. But my mind kept flashing back to the house, to the message carved into the wood. Don't open that door. Something inside me whispered that I had made a mistake stopping there, that I had taken something with me, something that didn't want to be left behind. Then the doorknob rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was trying to get inside. I moved fast, grabbing the fireplace poker from the hearth and backing toward the bedroom. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the front door. The rattling stopped. Silence stretched through the cabin, thick and suffocating. Then, ever so slowly, I heard footsteps retreating from the porch. Not hurried, not running, just walking away. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the poker until my hands ached. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body couldn't take the adrenaline anymore. I slid down against the wall and forced myself to breathe. I didn't sleep. Not really. I just sat there, waiting for the first light of dawn. And when the sun finally rose, I dared to step outside. The footprints were still there, leading up to my door. But there was something else now, something new, scratched into the wood just beside the frame, in jagged, uneven letters. It knows you saw it. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. This wasn't some prank. This wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. Someone, or something, had been here last night. And it knew I was afraid. I packed my bags within minutes. My uncle's cabin was no longer safe, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what wanted me to know it was watching. I had my car keys in my pocket, my duffel slung over my shoulder, and my heart pounding like a war drum as I flung open the door. I stopped dead, The footprints were gone. The message carved into the wood, gone, as if the door had never been touched. My breath came in short gasps as I turned, scanning the tree line. Something was off. I knew what I had seen. The only sign that anything had happened was the unmistakable weight of fear pressing down on me. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and for a brief moment, relief flooded me. I threw the car into reverse, speeding down the dirt road, kicking up dust in my desperation to leave. Then, as I rounded the first curve, my headlights caught something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes. The figure didn't move, just stood there. No face, no details, just a silhouette against the morning fog. Then it lifted one hand. Not a wave, not a signal, just a slow, deliberate point, straight at me. I jammed the car into drive and swerved around it, barely keeping control as I sped past. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. It's been 2 weeks since this all happened, and I haven't had any strange occurrences since that night. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know what followed me from that house. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that figure standing there in the dark, pointing. And I know it's still watching, and it will return. I don't talk about this much, and when I do, people either don't believe me or they try to rationalize it in a way that doesn't fit what actually happened. But I swear every word of this is true. This happened about 6 years ago, when I was in my mid-20s. I was living in northern Michigan at the time, working as a maintenance guy for a couple of rental cabins near a lake. It wasn't anything fancy, just a handful of small, rustic places mostly used by fishermen or families looking for a quiet weekend away. My boss was an older guy who owned the property, but didn't do much of the hands-on work anymore. So he paid me to take care of things. It was an easy enough job, some basic plumbing, keeping the generator running, making sure people weren't trashing the cabins. The kind of work that was just tedious enough that most people didn't want to do it, but not difficult enough to require a real professional. One weekend, we had a guy rent out the furthest cabin on the property, the one we called Cabin 6. It was the most isolated, sitting about a quarter mile away from the others, near the tree line. It wasn't the nicest cabin either, kind of old, with a weird smell no matter how many times I cleaned it. But people liked the privacy. The guy who rented it seemed normal enough at first. Mid-40s, average build, said he was in town for some hiking. He paid cash, which wasn't too unusual, and kept to himself. I didn't think much of him until the night he was supposed to leave. Checkout was noon. At 12:30, I walked up to Cabin 6 to make sure he was out and to do a quick clean before the next guests arrived. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Still nothing. Sometimes people left early and forgot to drop off the keys, so I used my master key to open the door. The cabin was empty, or at least it looked that way at first. His bag was still in the corner. A half-eaten sandwich was on the counter. The bed was unmade, but no sign of him, no note, no indication that he was planning to stay longer. That was weird, but not alarming, not yet. I figured maybe he went on one last hike before heading out, so I locked up and went about my day. By that evening, though, he still hadn't come back. His car was gone, but his stuff was still inside the cabin. At this point, I figured I should at least let my boss know, so I called him up. He was annoyed, but told me to wait until morning before calling the sheriff, just in case the guy came back late. I went to bed feeling uneasy, but I told myself people did stupid things all the time. Maybe he left in a rush and forgot his stuff. Maybe he had another place in town and just didn't care about leaving things behind. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. Then, at around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was an animal. The property had plenty of deer, raccoons, even the occasional black bear. But as I lay there, still half asleep, I heard it again. A creaking sound, the kind a wooden floor makes when someone steps on it. I froze. My place was small, basically a glorified shed near the main office. There shouldn't have been anyone inside but me. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed, gripping it tight as I listened. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I imagined it, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. Coming from the corner of my room. I snapped the flashlight on and aimed it towards the sound. Nothing. The room was empty. My door was locked. My windows were closed. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. But I know what I heard. And I swear, for a split second before I turned on the light, I felt someone there, standing over me, watching me. I barely slept the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I went straight to cabin 6, hoping, praying the guy had come back. But the cabin was exactly how I had left it. No sign of him, his stuff still there. It was like he had just walked out into the woods and never returned. I called my boss again, and this time he told me to call the sheriff. A deputy came out, took my statement, looked around, and eventually left with the guy's belongings, saying they'd try to track him down. But as far as I know, they never did. The guy was just gone. A few weeks later, I was cleaning cabin 6 for another guest when I noticed something I hadn't before. Under the bed, wedged deep in the corner, was a single dirty sock. I almost left it there, figuring it was just something the guy had lost. But when I pulled it out, I realized there was something inside. A piece of paper, folded up so many times, it was the size of a matchbook. I unrolled it, expecting to find some grocery list or random scribbles. Instead, scrawled in shaky, frantic handwriting, were the words, "Don't let him in." I got chills. I still get chills thinking about it, because now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I did let him in. That night, when I woke up to the sound of breathing, when I turned on the light and saw nothing there, what if he was there? What if he never really left? Okay, I don't even know where to start with this, but I guess I should just get it all out. I've never posted anything on here before, but after what happened to me, I need to know if something like this has happened to anyone else. Because I still don't have a good explanation, and it's messing with me. This happened last year, in November. I live in Michigan near Grand Rapids, but I was heading up north, to visit some friends who have a cabin near Grayling. It was supposed to be a guy's weekend. Drinking, fishing, sitting around a fire, all that. I left after work on Friday, which meant most of my drive was in the dark. If you've ever driven through the more rural parts of Michigan, you know how empty those highways feel at night. Just trees on either side, barely any streetlights, and long stretches without seeing another car. About 2 hours into the drive, I realized I needed to stop for gas. I had about a quarter tank left, but I didn't want to risk running low in the middle of nowhere. I pulled off at a small exit, the kind with just one gas station and maybe a diner or two. The place looked old, like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The only light came from the flickering sign above the pumps, and the inside of the station looked empty, except for the guy behind the counter who barely glanced up when I walked in. I went to pay inside because the card reader at the pump wasn't working. While I was waiting for the transaction to go through, I noticed a bulletin board near the door with missing person flyers. That's not unusual, especially in rural areas, but what caught my attention was how many there were. At least a dozen different faces staring back at me. Some of them looked recent, but others were old, the paper yellowed and curling at the edges. Something about it unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Small towns always have their own weird energy. I got back in my car and continued driving. About 15 minutes later, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck, big, old, maybe an F-150. It must have pulled onto the highway from that same gas station exit because I hadn't seen any other turnoffs. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I noticed the truck was keeping pace with me. Not tailgating, not trying to pass, just staying there. Too far back for me to see the driver, but close enough that it felt intentional. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then the truck started getting closer, not speeding up suddenly, just inching forward a little at a time. The highway was empty except for us, and the only light came from my headlights and his. There were no other cars, no houses, just trees lining the road on both sides. I sped up. So did he. I slowed down. So did he. Now I was getting nervous. I checked my phone. No service. Not surprising out here, but not exactly reassuring either. I told myself I just needed to make it to the next town, find a gas station or a store where there were people. I kept driving, but the next exit didn't come as soon as I expected. And the whole time, the truck stayed right behind me. Then his headlights started flashing. High beams on, then off. On, then off. Like he was trying to signal me. I had no idea what he wanted. Maybe my brake lights were out. Maybe he thought I dropped something. But then I remembered the missing person flyers, and something in my gut told me not to stop. After another minute, the truck suddenly sped up. My heart jumped. I thought he was going to ram me, but instead, he pulled into the other lane, like he was finally going to pass. For a split second, I felt relieved. Then, I saw the driver. Or, I should say, I didn't see the driver. The truck was close enough that I should have been able to see a face, but the cab was just dark. Not like the windows were tinted, just like there was nothing there. No shape, no movement, just empty darkness. The truck stayed beside me for a few seconds, then suddenly swerved back behind me, high beams flashing again. That was it. I lost it. I floored the gas pedal, pushing my little sedan way past what it was meant to handle. The engine whined, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. Finally, I saw a sign for an upcoming exit, a town name 2 miles ahead. I didn't even care what town it was. I took the exit doing at least 80 miles per hour, barely making the turn. The truck followed. The road led into a small town, mostly dark, but there was a 24-hour diner still open. I swerved into the parking lot and jumped out of my car, running for the door. Inside, the place was nearly empty except for an older waitress and a guy sitting at the counter. They both looked up when I came in, breathless and probably looking like a lunatic. I turned to look out the window. The truck was gone. I don't mean it drove past or turned around. I mean, it was just gone. The road was empty. No taillights, no engine sounds. Just silence. The waitress must have noticed how freaked out I looked because she asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to say. I just muttered something about a weird guy following me and sat down, trying to collect myself. I stayed there for about an hour, drinking coffee, convincing myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then, I finally got back on the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful. I made it to my friend's cabin and had a great weekend, but I didn't tell them what happened. It just felt stupid, like something out of a bad horror movie. I still don't know if I was just overtired and seeing things, or if something actually happened that night. But every once in a while, I think about those missing person flyers, and I wonder how many of them stopped at that same gas station.